Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in Appalachian history. We begin our dive into a story that still echoes through the mountains of Kentucky. It was the end of the 19th century, and the Appalachian Mountains held secrets that should never have come to light. In the heart of Kentucky, among the misty peaks and deep valleys of the Pine Mountain region, a small community called Harland lived isolated from the outside world. The roads were winding trails that snaked between jagged rocks and treacherous canyons. The nearest train was a 3-day ride away, and the telegraph was a luxury few knew about. In this remote and almost primitive setting, there lived a woman who would become the center of one of the darkest stories ever recorded in the Harland County archives. Her name was Lydia Krenshaw, a 42-year-old widow who lived alone in a log cabin built high on a hill, surrounded by centuries-old oak trees that seemed to whisper secrets to the wind. Lydia had arrived in the area 5 years earlier, from somewhere in East Tennessee, carrying only a worn-out leather suitcase and vague stories about her husband's untimely death. The nearest neighbors lived nearly a mile away, and even then, few could say that they really knew the dark-eyed, gray-haired woman who rarely came down to town. What made Lydia Krenshaw famous was not her skills as a healer, although she was known for preparing herbal remedies from the mountains. It wasn't her beauty, already faded by the years and the harsh climate of Appalachia. What put her forever in the macabre records of American history was something far more sinister. Something that began to unfold in the fall of 1894. It was a time when laws were slowly coming to the mountains of Kentucky. The county sheriff, a man named Thomas Whitfield, had jurisdiction over a territory too vast to patrol properly. Many crimes went uninvestigated. Many deaths were attributed to the natural dangers of mountain life, and many disappearances were simply accepted as part of the brutal reality of that God-forsaken place. The first suspicions about Lydia began when travelers passing through the region began to disappear. It was not uncommon for street traders, prospectors in search of coal, or entire families moving west to simply vanish on the dangerous trails of Appalachia. Bears, wolves, treacherous canyons, sudden storms. There were 1,000 ways to die in those mountains without a trace. But there was a disturbing pattern in the disappearances that caught the attention of the local pastor, the Reverend Samuel Hayes. During his Sunday sermons in the small log church in downtown Harland, he began to notice that many of the missing travelers had one thing in common. They had all been last seen near the hill where Lydia Krenshaw's cabin stood. Reverend Hayes was an observant man, accustomed to reading between the lines of his parishioners' confessions. He knew that in the mountains of Kentucky, where the law of survival prevailed over any moral code, some people were capable of acts that would defy the comprehension of any civilized soul, and something about that lonely woman on the hill bothered him deeply. It was on a cold October morning that everything began to change. A cloth merchant hailing from Louisville named Edgar Morrison had stopped in town to rest and replenish his supplies before continuing his journey to Virginia. He was a well-known man in the region who had been on that route for more than 10 years, always punctual, always reliable. Morrison never reached his next destination. His cart, drawn by 2 bay horses, was found 3 weeks later in a deep ravine 5 miles from Lydia's hut. The horses were dead, and the merchant was nowhere to be found. His cloth and money were gone, but what puzzled Sheriff Whitfield most was the state of the wagon. Edgar Morrison's wagon had not simply fallen into the canyon by accident. The wheels had been deliberately damaged, and there were strange marks on the wood that suggested the use of tools. Even more disturbing, Sheriff Whitfield found trails of blood that led from the wagon to a trail that went directly up the hill of Lydia Krenshaw. Whitfield was a practical man shaped by 20 years of enforcing the law in a region where justice often depended more on force than on legal codes. He knew that accusing a lonely woman without solid evidence could cause more problems than it solved. The mountains of Kentucky had their own rules, and interfering with someone's life without hard evidence could result in a bullet in the back during a dark night. Even so, the sheriff decided to pay a discreet visit to Lydia's cabin. It was a gray November morning when he climbed the steep trail, accompanied only by the sound of the wind moaning among the pine trees. The cabin rose like a shadow against the leaden sky, its chimney emitting dense smoke that had a strange, almost sweet smell that made Whitfield's stomach turn. Lydia greeted him at the door with a disturbing calm. She showed no surprise or nervousness when she saw the representative of the law on her property. Her dark eyes scanned the sheriff's face with an intensity that made him feel as if he were being evaluated by a predator. When Whitfield mentioned Morrison's disappearance, she just shook her head slowly and muttered that there were too many dangers in those mountains for a man traveling alone. During the brief conversation, the sheriff noticed details that made him deeply uncomfortable. There were men's clothes drying on a rope behind the hut, pieces that seemed too big to belong to any woman. On the porch, he saw tools that a lonely widow would hardly need: heavy axes, saws, and long-bladed knives that gleamed with suspicious care. Even more disturbing was what Whitfield observed through the half-open window of the cabin. On the kitchen table, there were pieces of meat being prepared for smoking. Nothing unusual about this, except for the fact that the meat had a color and texture that didn't look like deer or wild boar. The sheriff had spent his whole life hunting in those mountains, and what he saw on Lydia's table looked like no wild animal he knew. Whitfield left the cabin with more questions than answers, but with a growing certainty that Lydia Krenshaw was hiding terrible secrets. He began a discreet investigation, talking to the few neighbors scattered around the region, collecting fragments of information that together formed a terrifying mosaic. The town's blacksmith, a German named Henrik Müller, reported that Lydia had bought an unusual amount of cutting tools from him in recent months. She always paid in cash, clean bills that contrasted with her rustic appearance. The owner of the local grocery store, Samuel Cooper, confirmed that she bought salt in enormous quantities, far more than a single person could use to preserve common game meat. Even more telling was the testimony of the local midwife, an elderly woman named Martha Jenkins, who had visited Lydia's cabin a few months earlier to treat a supposed illness. Martha described an unmistakable smell that permeated the entire property, a sweet and sickening odor that she associated with decaying flesh. When asked what she had seen inside the cabin, Martha lowered her voice and said that she had noticed bones piled up in a corner of the kitchen, bones that were too large to belong to any common animal in the area. The macabre puzzle began to form when Sheriff Whitfield discovered that the disappearances were no coincidence. In the past 2 years, at least 7 travelers had disappeared on the trails near Lydia's Hill. All were men traveling alone. All were carrying money or valuable goods, and all were last seen heading in the direction of the secluded hut. Among the missing were a prospector from West Virginia named Joseph Banks, an itinerant preacher known as Brother Michael, and 2 whiskey merchant brothers who were en route from Tennessee to Ohio. Each of these men had left a family waiting for their return, families who would never receive news about the fate of their loved ones. What made it all the more sinister was Lydia's apparent normality during this time. She kept going down to the city occasionally to buy supplies, always polite but distant, always paying for her purchases with money that no one knew where it came from. Some locals even commented that she seemed to be eating better lately, gaining weight and a healthier appearance that contrasted with the typical thinness of mountain dwellers. The first concrete evidence of the horror lurking in Lydia's cabin came from an unexpected source. It was December of 1894 when a local hunter named Benjamin Taylor got lost during a snowstorm and sought shelter on Lydia's property. What he saw that night would forever change the community's perception of the lone woman on the hill. Taylor knocked on the door of the cabin during a particularly violent blizzard, shivering with cold and with his fingers almost frozen. Lydia greeted him with a hospitality that he later reported seemed too forced, as if she were playing the part of a good hostess. She invited him in and offered him hot food and a place to sleep until the storm passed. During the night, Taylor was awakened by strange sounds coming from the basement of the cabin. They were metallic noises, as if someone was using heavy tools on something hard. Curious and slightly alarmed, he quietly descended the stairs and peered through a crack in the basement door. What he saw made him vomit immediately and almost faint from horror. Lydia was working on a makeshift table using an axe and several knives to process something that was clearly not animal meat. The remains of at least 2 human bodies were scattered throughout the basement in different stages of dismemberment. There were hooks hanging from the ceiling, parts of which hung that Taylor preferred not to identify. The floor was covered in a mixture of sawdust and clotted blood, and the air was thick with a nauseating smell of decay and spices. Taylor managed to quietly climb back to the upper floor, pretend to sleep, and escape the cabin before dawn. He ran through the snow to the nearest town, stumbling and falling multiple times in his desperate rush to get away from that cursed place. His first words upon arriving at Sheriff Whitfield's house were incoherent, mixed with sobs and shivering that had nothing to do with the morning chill. Taylor's description provided the sheriff with the evidence he needed, but it also created a dire dilemma. In the isolated mountains of Kentucky, justice was often applied summarily, especially when it came to such heinous crimes. Whitfield knew that if the community found out the whole truth about Lydia Krenshaw, she wouldn't live long enough to be tried by a court. Even so, duty required him to investigate Taylor's allegations. On the 22nd of December, Whitfield organized a small team consisting of himself, local deputy Marcus Green, and 2 volunteers, blacksmith Henrik Mueller and merchant Samuel Cooper. They climbed the hill on a freezing morning, armed and prepared for the worst. The hut looked deserted when they arrived. There was no smoke coming out of the chimney, and the windows were covered with dark cloths. Whitfield knocked on the door, identified himself as sheriff, and demanded entry. The silence that followed was unsettling, broken only by the sound of the wind whistling between the bare branches of the trees. When they forced their way in, they found the cabin seemingly abandoned. The furniture was in place, but there were signs of a hasty exit. Drawers open, clothes strewn across the floor, and the fireplace still warm with fresh ash. Lydia had disappeared, but she had left behind evidence that would confirm the worst nightmares of any civilized person. The basement revealed a scenario that surpassed in horror even Taylor's descriptions. In addition to the human remains that the hunter had seen, the team discovered trunks full of clothing and personal belongings that clearly belonged to the missing victims. There were leather wallets with identity documents, pocket watches engraved with names and dates, and jewelry that was later recognized by the families of the disappeared. Even more shocking was the discovery of a detailed diary that Lydia kept, recording each of her victims with a clinical precision that revealed the methodical mind behind the crimes. She described how she lured travelers to her hut by offering shelter and food, how she drugged them with teas made from toxic plants in the region, and how she processed the bodies for consumption and sale. The diary revealed that Lydia wasn't just killing for money or for sadistic pleasure. She had developed a macabre business selling human flesh disguised as wild boar meat to merchants passing through the region. Some of the best restaurants in Louisville and Lexington may have unknowingly served the remains of Lydia Crenshaw's victims to their most distinguished customers. Detailed notes showed that she classified her victims according to age, weight, and physical condition as a butcher would evaluate cattle. she had developed specific techniques of preservation and seasoning, turning the most horrendous act imaginable into a cold and calculated commercial operation. Among the belongings found was a considerable amount of money hidden in ceramic jars, buried in the basement floor. Lydia had amassed a small fortune from her crimes, money she never had a chance to spend due to her sudden escape. Lydia Krenshaw's escape sparked a manhunt that spread across 3 states. Sheriff Whitfield sent telegrams to every town with a railroad station within a 200-mile radius, describing the suspect and warning of her extreme dangerousness. Newspapers in Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia published sensationalist articles about the Appalachian Cannibal Witch, as the press began to call her. The discovery in the cabin attracted curious people from all over the region. In the days following the revelation of the crimes, hundreds of people climbed the hill to see with their own eyes the place where such a monstrosity had occurred. Sheriff Whitfield had to post guards to protect the crime scene and prevent morbid souvenirs from being stolen by visitors. Among the curious was Dr. Edmund Hartwell, a medical examiner from Lexington who had read about the case in the newspapers. Hartwell was a man of science, fascinated by the criminological aspects of human behavior. He offered to examine the remains found in the basement and try to identify the victims through physical characteristics and personal belongings. Dr. Hartwell's work revealed even more disturbing details. His analysis showed that Lydia had perfected her techniques over time, becoming more efficient and careful with each victim. The older bodies showed signs of hesitation and inexperience, while the more recent ones demonstrated an anatomical knowledge that suggested extensive practice. Hartwell also discovered that some of the victims had been kept alive for days before being killed. There was evidence that Lydia kept them prisoner in a small room in the basement, feeding them properly to maintain the quality of the meat. This revelation added a dimension of psychological torture to the crimes that shocked even the most experienced investigators. During their excavations around the property, Dr. Hartwell's team found the remains of at least a dozen victims, buried in shallow graves scattered across the hill. Some were just bones, bleached by time and the elements. Others still had fragments of clothing that allowed partial identification. One particularly gruesome discovery was a wedding ring engraved with the initials E.M. Edgar Morrison, the cloth merchant, whose disappearance had sparked the investigation. Meanwhile, the search for Lydia continued without success. She seemed to have disappeared completely, as if she had dissolved into the mists of the mountains. Some believed that she had died of cold during the winter escape. Others suspected that she had accomplices who helped her escape. There were even theories that she possessed secret hiding places in the caves of Appalachia, where she could keep herself hidden for months. The Reverend Samuel Hayes, who had been one of the first to suspect Lydia, organized prayer vigils for the souls of the victims. During his sermons, he spoke of the evil that can lurk beneath the most innocent appearance, and of how loneliness and isolation can corrupt even the humblest souls. His words echoed through the mountains as a lament for the dead and a warning for the living. The investigation also revealed disturbing connections to other unsolved cases in the region. In the county archives, Whitfield found reports of disappearances that dated back to before Lydia's arrival, but followed a similar pattern. This raised the terrifying possibility that she was not the only perpetrator of such atrocities in the isolated mountains of Kentucky. One particularly intriguing aspect of the case was the discovery of correspondence between Lydia and a man identified only as J.R. in the letters. These missives, written in a simple code, discussed special deliveries and fresh goods in a way that suggested a wider network of criminal activity. Sheriff Whitfield suspected that Lydia was part of an organized group that took advantage of the isolation of Appalachia to conduct illicit business. The letters mentioned meetings in a town called Pineville, located on the border between Kentucky and Tennessee. Whitfield sent deputies to investigate, but they returned without finding any trace of the mysterious JR or suspicious activity in the area. It was as if the entire network had disintegrated with the discovery of Lydia's crimes. The journalistic coverage of the case attracted the attention of criminologists and scholars of human behavior from all over the country. Articles were published in medical journals discussing the psychological aspects of cannibalism and extreme violence. Lydia Krenshaw became a case study, a representation of what experts called the complete moral deterioration of the isolated individual. The effects of the case spread far beyond the mountains of Kentucky. Travelers began to avoid the isolated routes of Appalachia, preferring the main roads, even if they were longer. Isolated inns lost customers, and a general atmosphere of mistrust took hold in the rural communities of the region. The name Lydia Krenshaw became synonymous with betrayal and horror. A dark legend whispered around the campfires during cold winter nights. 3 months after the discovery of the crimes, an unexpected clue emerged from an unlikely source. A young woman named Mary Beth Collins, the daughter of a Bell County tobacco farmer, came to Sheriff Whitfield with a story that would make anyone's blood run cold. Mary Beth claimed to have seen Lydia Krenshaw alive, hiding in a cave deep in the mountains of the region known as Cumberland Gap. The young woman said she was collecting medicinal herbs for her sick mother when she got lost during a dense fog. Seeking shelter, she discovered a cave entrance partially hidden by branches and stones. As she entered to protect herself from the cold, she heard human voices echoing from the depths of the cave. Driven by curiosity and the hope of finding help, she followed the sounds through narrow, damp tunnels. What Mary Beth saw in the depths of that cave confirmed the worst fears about Lydia's fate. The fugitive had established a primitive camp in a large, natural chamber lit by makeshift torches. But she was not alone. There were at least 3 other people with her, including an elderly man who Mary Beth described as having the appearance of a preacher, and a younger woman with torn clothes and a terrified expression. From her hiding place behind a rock formation, Mary Beth observed a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Lydia was preparing a meal over a campfire, and the ingredients left no doubt about the nature of her macabre cooking. The young woman was bound and gagged, clearly destined to become the next victim of Lydia's monstrous appetite. Mary Beth managed to escape the cave undetected, but it took her several hours to find her way back to civilization through the dense Appalachian forest. When she finally arrived at her family's farm, she was in shock, babbling incoherently about caves, campfires, and unspeakable horrors. It took 2 days for her to regain enough composure to tell her story coherently. Sheriff Whitfield immediately organized a search expedition, but faced enormous challenges. The mountains of the Cumberland Gap were a maze of interconnected caves, some of which stretched for miles underground. Many had never been explored, and some were known to be dangerously unstable. Finding a specific cave based only on the confusing description of a frightened young woman would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. The expedition included 12 armed men, as well as 2 local guides who knew the caves in the region. They carried ropes, flashlights, and enough supplies for several days of searching. The plan was to divide into smaller groups and systematically explore all known cave entrances within a 10-mile radius of the spot where Mary Beth claimed to have been lost. For 3 days, the search parties explored damp, dark caves, following tunnels that sometimes ended in walls of solid rock, sometimes opened into chasms that seemed bottomless. The work was dangerous and exhausting. 2 men were temporarily lost in a complex tunnel system, and another suffered injuries when part of a cave roof collapsed. On the 4th day, the group led by Deputy Marcus Green made a discovery that confirmed at least part of Mary Beth's story. In a cave located approximately 8 miles from the location indicated by the young woman, they found clear evidence of recent human occupation. There were still warm campfire ashes, food scraps, and personal belongings, scattered as if the occupants had left in a hurry. Among the abandoned items was a shawl that Mary Beth positively identified as being worn by Lydia Krenshaw. There were also cutting tools stained with substances he chose not to identify, and bone fragments that were clearly not from wild animals. More disturbing still, they found torn pieces of women's clothing that matched Mary Beth's description of the young woman she had seen tied up. The discovery confirmed that Lydia had continued her monstrous activities even after fleeing her cabin. But it also raised unsettling questions about how many accomplices she might have and how extensive her terror network was. Investigators began to suspect that they were dealing not just with an isolated killer, but with a criminal organization that used the isolation of Appalachia to conduct activities that would defy the comprehension of any civilized person. The search for Lydia intensified, but she always seemed to be one step ahead of her pursuers. Sporadic reports of sightings came in from different parts of the mountains. But when search teams arrived at the indicated locations, they found only cold tracks and evidence of hasty departures. It was as if she possessed a supernatural knowledge of the mountains or information about the movements of the search teams. The atmosphere of terror that spread across the region was intensified by a series of disappearances that occurred during the search itself. 2 people who had volunteered to help in the search simply disappeared overnight, leaving only their weapons and equipment behind. This raised the terrifying possibility that Lydia was actively hunting her pursuers, turning the search into a deadly cat-and-mouse game in the dark depths of Appalachia. The winter of 1895 brought a dramatic change in the search for Lydia Krenshaw. Heavy snowfall made the Appalachian Mountains virtually impassable, forcing the temporary suspension of search operations. Sheriff Whitfield hoped that extreme cold and food shortages would force Lydia out of hiding, but he underestimated the ability of a woman who had adapted to the darker aspects of human existence. During the winter months, a series of macabre discoveries began to appear in the mountains. Hunters found human remains partially buried in the snow, some clearly recent, others that appeared to have been preserved by the bitter cold. The bodies showed unmistakable signs of Lydia's work: precise dismemberments, removal of specific organs, and evidence that parts had been removed for consumption. What disturbed investigators most was the discovery that Lydia had learned to use winter to her advantage. She was preserving human flesh in the natural ice of the caves, creating a stockpile that would allow her to survive the toughest months. Dr. Hartwell, who was continuing to review the evidence, estimated that she had accumulated enough provisions to sustain herself for at least 6 months without having to make new victims. In February, a shocking event completely changed the nature of the search. A group of lumberjacks working near the Cumberland River found the remains of an entire family that had disappeared the previous fall. The Roberts, father, mother, and 2 young children, had left Tennessee for Kentucky to start a new life, but they never reached their destination. The discovery of the Roberts family's bodies revealed that Lydia had crossed a line that even her previous crimes had not reached. She had murdered children, something that deeply shocked a community already traumatized by her crimes. The evidence suggested that the entire family had been held captive for weeks before being killed, and that the children had witnessed the fate of their parents before meeting their own end. Public outrage reached unprecedented levels. Angry mobs gathered in the towns of the region, demanding that the search be intensified and that Lydia be found alive to face popular justice. The governor of Kentucky was pressured to send the National Guard to assist in the search, but weather conditions still made any large-scale operation extremely dangerous. It was during this period of collective anger that an unexpected figure emerged in Lydia Crenshaw's story. A man known only as Hunter Jake introduced himself to Sheriff Whitfield, offering his services. Jake was a local legend, a tracker who had spent decades hunting in the most remote mountains of Appalachia. He knew caves that didn't appear on any map, secret trails used by smugglers, and had an understanding of the mountains that bordered on the supernatural. Hunter Jake claimed to have seen signs of Lydia's presence during his own hunting expeditions. He had found female footprints in impossible places, hastily extinguished campfires in caves that most people didn't even know existed, and blood trails on rocks that suggested the transport of bodies across nearly impossible terrain. What intrigued the sheriff the most was Jake's assertion that Lydia wasn't simply hiding. She was actively hunting. The tracker had found evidence that she was following and studying the search teams, learning their patterns and routes. On several occasions, he had discovered observation points in the mountains where someone had been hiding for hours, watching the movements of the pursuers through primitive binoculars. The collaboration between Whitfield and Hunter Jake marked the beginning of a new phase in the search for Lydia. Instead of noisy and obvious expeditions, they began to use more subtle tactics, moving silently through the mountains and following barely noticeable tracks. Jake taught Whitfield how to read signs that most people would ignore, specifically shaped broken branches, displaced rocks, barely invisible marks on tree trunks. During one of these silent expeditions, Jake and Whitfield made a discovery that revealed the true extent of Lydia's network. They found a cave that had been turned into a kind of headquarters, with detailed maps of the region marked with common travel routes, locations of isolated farms, and spots where travelers used to camp overnight. The maps showed a level of planning and organization that went far beyond opportunistic assassinations. Lydia had created a methodological system for identifying and capturing victims, studying movement patterns, and identifying the most vulnerable targets. There was also evidence that she had recruited others to help her, including people who were apparently living normal lives in the towns of the region. Among the documents found was a list of names that made Whitfield's blood run cold. The list included respectable people from the community, a merchant, a bank employee, even a church board member. If the documents were true, Lydia had built a network of accomplices that extended far beyond the isolated mountains, infiltrating the very communities they thought were safe from her malign influence. The discovery of Lydia Krenshaw's network of accomplices set off a wave of paranoia that swept through Appalachian communities like wildfire. Sheriff Whitfield now faced a dire dilemma: how to investigate reputable people in the community without causing widespread panic and without alerting potential conspirators to his discovery. The situation became even more complicated when Whitfield began to discreetly investigate the names on the list. Merchant Thomas Bradley, owner of Harlan's largest hardware store, had sold unusual quantities of cutting tools for the past 2 years, always to out-of-town buyers who paid in cash. The bank employee, Robert Matthews, had processed suspicious money transfers to accounts in distant cities, transactions that made no sense considering the local economy. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Church Council member Deacon William Foster had been seen on multiple occasions driving a loaded wagon in the direction of the mountains at night. When questioned casually by neighbors, he always claimed to be doing missionary work in remote communities, but he was never able to provide specific details about these trips. Hunter Jake contributed an unsettling observation. During his expeditions through the mountains, he had noticed signs of regular traffic on trails that were supposedly only used by occasional hunters. There were wagon wheel marks in places where no vehicles should be able to pass, and temporary supply depots hidden in caves that suggested a well-organized logistical operation. The investigation revealed that Lydia's network was more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. She was not just an isolated assassin, but the leader of an organization that took advantage of the isolation of Appalachia to conduct activities that went far beyond cannibalism. There was evidence of smuggling, human trafficking, and even trade in human organs to buyers in distant cities. The documents found in the cave included correspondence with people in Louisville, Cincinnati, and even Chicago, discussing special goods and unique products in coded language that left little doubt about their true nature. One particularly shocking letter discussed the growing demand for exotic meat in high-end, big city restaurants, where wealthy patrons paid fortunes for forbidden culinary experiences. In March 1895, the situation came to a head when Mary Beth Collins, the young woman who had first spotted Lydia in the caves, disappeared from her farm during the night. There were no signs of a struggle, and her personal belongings were left behind. But there were strange footprints around the house that suggested the presence of multiple people. The Collins family was terrified. Mary Beth had become a crucial witness in the case against Lydia, and her positive identification of the fugitive had been instrumental in confirming that she was still alive and active in the region. Now it seemed that Lydia had decided to eliminate the main witness against her, demonstrating an audacity that surprised even the most experienced investigators. Hunter Jake immediately organized a tracking expedition following the footprints leading from the Collins farm toward the mountains. The marks were confusing, clearly left by people trying to obscure their trail, but Jake was able to identify at least 4 different sets of footprints, including one that he believed belonged to a woman. The trail took the search team through increasingly treacherous terrain, up steep mountain slopes, and down hidden ravines that looked like they hadn't been touched by human feet in decades. For 2 days, they followed fragmented tracks through a landscape that became more hostile and isolated with each mile. On the 3rd morning, Jake made a discovery that completely changed his understanding of the situation. Hidden in a deep ravine, he found an operation that surpassed in scale and organization even his most pessimistic estimates. There were several temporary structures built with wood and canvas, forming a kind of base camp for activities that clearly went far beyond Lydia's individual crimes. The camp included specific areas for different functions: a place for processing goods, another for storage and natural ice, and even an area that seemed to be used to train new members of the organization. There was evidence that at least 15 different people had used the camp recently, turning what began as the search for an isolated killer into an investigation of an extensive criminal network. Among the structures, Jake found one that made him feel a deep chill running down his spine. It was a kind of makeshift prison, with metal hooks attached to the walls and chains still stained with substances he preferred not to identify. The smell emanating from the structure was unmistakable: fear, suffering, and something much worse that Jake couldn't name. Even more shocking was the discovery of detailed records that documented not only Lydia's victims, but also the activities of the entire network. There were lists of customers in faraway cities, prices for different products, and even delivery schedules that showed a business operation running with terrifying efficiency. The records revealed that Mary Beth Collins had not been kidnapped to silence her as a witness. She had been captured to become part of a special request from a client in Nashville, who had specifically requested a healthy young woman from the countryside. The discovery of this information filled Jake and Whitfield with desperate urgency. They had little time to find Mary Beth before she was sent to a fate that no human being should ever face. The discovery of the delivery schedule in the organization's records revealed a crucial piece of information. Mary Beth Collins would be transported to Nashville in less than 48 hours. The method of transport described in the documents was as ingenious as it was terrible. She would be hidden in a shipment of lumber, drugged to keep herself unconscious during the journey, and delivered to a specific address in the city's industrial area. Hunter Jake studied the maps found in the camp and identified the most likely route that would be used for transport. There were only 2 mountain trails that would allow a heavy wagon loaded with timber to pass, and both converged on a main road leading directly to Nashville. If they managed to intercept the shipment at one of these convergence points, they would have a chance of rescuing Mary Beth and capturing key members of the network. Sheriff Whitfield organized a carefully planned ambush, positioning armed men on both possible routes. He knew he would have only one opportunity. If the organization suspected that their operations had been discovered, they would simply change their routes and methods, making future intercepts much more difficult. At dawn, on the 23rd of March, the patience of Whitfield's men was rewarded. A heavy wagon drawn by 4 horses began to descend the northern track, loaded with logs arranged in such a way as to completely conceal any additional load. The conductor was a man Whitfield recognized immediately: Thomas Bradley, the hardware dealer, whose name was on the list of accomplices. The ambush was executed with military precision. Whitfield's men surrounded the wagon from all directions, preventing any attempt to escape. Bradley initially tried to stand by his story, that he was only transporting lumber for a customer in Nashville, but his composure crumbled when investigators began removing the logs from the shipment. Hidden in the center of the cargo, exactly as described in the documents, was Mary Beth Collins. She was unconscious but alive, drugged with some substance that kept her in a state of deep stupor. There was also another victim that no one expected to find, a young man in his 20s who had disappeared from a neighboring farm 2 weeks earlier. Under interrogation, Thomas Bradley initially tried to deny any knowledge of the organization's more sinister activities. He claimed to be just a carrier paid to take special goods to specific customers without asking questions. But when confronted with specific evidence found in the camp, including pay stubs in his own handwriting, he finally fell apart and began to reveal the true extent of Lydia Krenshaw's network. Bradley's confession revealed that the organization had been operating for more than 5 years, long before Lydia established her cabin in the mountains of Kentucky. She had arrived in the region as a member of an existing network, bringing knowledge and contacts that allowed her to significantly expand operations. Bradley described Lydia not only as a murderer, but as a brilliant strategist who had turned opportunistic crimes into a lucrative, well-organized business. According to Bradley, the network included members in at least 6 different states, with operations centered in mountainous and isolated regions where law enforcement was weak and disappearances could easily be attributed to natural accidents. Each cell of the organization specialized in different aspects of the business. Some focused on capturing victims, others on processing and transporting, and still others on selling to end customers. The most shocking revelation was that the chain had developed a specific clientele among the elite of several American cities. Exclusive restaurants, private clubs, and even certain secret societies paid fortunes for unique culinary experiences that satisfied the most wicked appetites of their members. Bradley mentioned names that included prominent politicians, wealthy industrialists, and respected social figures who would never be suspected of participating in such atrocities. The interrogation also revealed the location of Lydia Krenshaw's current hideout. According to Bradley, she had moved to a network of natural caves in Tennessee, near the Virginia border, where she had established an even larger and more sophisticated operation. The place was protected by at least 10 armed men and included facilities to hold prisoners for prolonged periods. With this information, Whitfield organized his most ambitious operation to date. He requested assistance from Tennessee authorities and assembled a force of more than 30 armed men, including several members of the local militia. The operation would be risky. The caves described by Bradley were in extremely difficult terrain, and Lydia had the advantage of knowing the territory perfectly. Before leaving for Tennessee, Whitfield made the decision to secretly arrest the other accomplices identified on the list found at the camp. Simultaneous operations were conducted against Robert Matthews at the bank and Deacon William Foster at the church. Both men were captured without resistance, but their arrests revealed even more about the depth of corruption that had infected the community. Matthews confessed to laundering money for the organization through complex bank transfers, while Foster admitted to using his position in the church to identify vulnerable families who could be targeted for kidnappings. The discovery that even religious institutions had been infiltrated by Lydia's network deeply shocked a community that was already traumatized by the crimes. Meanwhile, Mary Beth Collins and the rescued young man were taken for medical care. Both were physically unharmed, but the psychological effects of their experience were evident. Mary Beth was able to provide additional information about what she had seen during her captivity, including descriptions of other victims who were still being held prisoner in Lydia's hideout. The expedition to Tennessee departed Harland on a gray April morning of 1895. 32 armed men, including Sheriff Whitfield, Hunter Jake, and a contingent of volunteer militiamen, followed Thomas Bradley's directions through trails that became increasingly treacherous as they approached the state line. The journey took 3 days through mountainous terrain that tested the limits of human endurance. The trails were too narrow for horses, forcing men to continue on foot, carrying heavy equipment. Constant rains turned the ground into slippery mud, and the dense fog that rose from the valleys made navigation extremely difficult. Hunter Jake led the group, following almost imperceptible clues left by members of Lydia's organization. He identified specific landmarks mentioned by Bradley: a skull-shaped rock, an oak tree struck by lightning, a waterfall that tumbled into a perfectly round natural pool. Each landmark took them deeper into territory that seemed untouched by civilization. On the third night, when they were camped less than 5 miles from Lydia's supposed hideout, the expedition received an unexpected visitor. A man appeared silently at the edge of their camp, emerging from the darkness like a ghost. He identified himself as Samuel Pike, a local hunter who had been watching their activities since they entered Tennessee. Pike brought disturbing news. He confirmed the existence of the cave complex described by Bradley, but warned that the situation was much worse than they had imagined. According to Pike, there were at least 20 people in the hideout, including several armed men who constantly patrolled the surroundings. More alarmingly, he had seen evidence that the site was being used for activities that went far beyond the crimes already known. Pike described structures built inside the caves that suggested long-term operations. There were cold storage areas using natural ice, makeshift laboratories where chemicals were processed, and even a kind of operating room where medical procedures were performed. Lydia's organization had evolved into something that resembled an industrial operation rather than isolated crimes. Even more shocking was Pike's revelation about the prisoners held in the compound. He had counted at least 15 people being held captive, including several children who had been kidnapped from isolated farms within a 100-mile radius. Some of the victims were obviously being groomed for processing, while others seemed to be being kept alive for purposes that Pike could not fully comprehend. With this information, Whitfield realized that his force of 32 men might not be sufficient for a successful operation. He sent messengers back to Kentucky requesting reinforcements, but he knew that any delay could result in the deaths of more victims. The decision to proceed with the resources available was one of the most difficult of his career as a law enforcer. Pike agreed to serve as a guide for the final assault, using his intimate knowledge of the terrain to lead Whitfield's force to the compound by a route that would avoid the known lookout points. The plan was to attack before dawn, when the surveillance would be more relaxed and the confusion of darkness could be used to the attackers' advantage. At dawn on May the 1st, the expedition approached the cave complex. What they found exceeded even their darkest expectations. The main entrance to the cave had been fortified with wooden palisades and strategically placed firing points. There were armed guards in elevated positions, and the entire compound was protected by a series of booby traps that could easily kill or seriously injure any intruder. Hunter Jake used his tracking skills to identify alternate entrances to the cave system. He discovered at least 3 smaller openings that could allow access to the complex, though all were dangerous and required climbing through unstable rock formations. The strategy was to divide the force into multiple groups, each attacking simultaneously through different entrances. The attack began at exactly 4 in the morning, with a signal from Jake echoing through the mountains. The main group, led by Whitfield, attacked the main entrance, while smaller groups infiltrated through the side openings. Resistance was immediate and fierce. The defenders were well armed and clearly prepared to repel any attack. The battle in the caves was unlike anything Whitfield's men had experienced. The darkness was almost complete, broken only by the flickering light of torches and lanterns. The sound of gunfire echoed through the stone tunnels, creating a deafening cacophony that made communication nearly impossible. Men stumbled and fell into narrow passages, some wounded by gunfire, others by falls into hidden crevasses. For 2 hours, the battle raged through the underground labyrinth. Slowly, the attackers gained ground, forcing the defenders to retreat into the deeper chambers of the compound. It was during this phase of the struggle that Whitfield finally came face to face with Lydia Krenshaw, the woman who had become the center of one of the most extensive criminal investigations in Appalachian history. Lydia was in the main chamber of the complex, a large natural cave that had been transformed into a kind of command room. She showed no fear or surprise at seeing Whitfield and his men entering the chamber. Instead, she greeted them with a disturbing calm, as if she were welcoming guests into her home. Her first words were a question that chilled the blood of all present. "Have you arrived in time for the party?" The main chamber, where Lydia Krenshaw had her last confrontation, was a living testimony to the extent of her madness. The walls of the natural cave had been decorated with macabre trophies of her victims, clothes hung like grim flags, personal effects arranged on makeshift shelves, and something that made even the most hardened men on the expedition recoil in horror: a collection of human bones arranged in geometric patterns that suggested some kind of grotesque ritual. Lydia was dressed in a dress that had once been elegant, but was now stained with substances that no one wanted to identify. Her gray hair was loose, framing a face that still showed traces of the beauty she must have possessed in her youth, but which was now distorted by something that went far beyond simple madness. Her eyes shone with a cold, calculating wit that made Whitfield realize he was dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple, unhinged killer. "You're just in time for the farewell banquet," Lydia said, gesturing to a makeshift table in the center of the chamber. On the table was laid out what she clearly considered an elaborate meal, prepared with ingredients that made the stomachs of everyone present turn. "I spent hours preparing something special to mark the end of this phase of our work." Whitfield tried to maintain his professional composure, but the scene before him defied any attempt at rationality. "Lydia Krenshaw, you are under arrest for the murders of at least 20 people and for the crimes of kidnapping, cannibalism, and conspiracy," he declared, his voice echoing through the stone chamber. Lydia's response was a laugh that echoed through the walls of the cave like the sound of something broken beyond repair. 20 people? Oh, Sheriff, you greatly underestimate the scope of our work here. 20 is just what you found. The reality is much more comprehensive. As she spoke, other members of the organization began to emerge from the shadows of the chamber. Men and women who had surrendered when armed resistance became futile, all looking at Lydia with a devotion bordering on religious fanaticism. It was clear that she wasn't just the leader of the organization. She had become something of a messianic figure for people who had completely abandoned any semblance of normal human morality. "You don't understand what you interrupted here," Lydia continued, walking slowly across the chamber as if she were giving a lecture. "We weren't just murderers or cannibals. We were pioneers exploring territories of human experience that civilized society is too cowardly to consider. Each person we brought here contributed to a greater knowledge about the fundamental nature of existence." Hunter Jake, who had remained silent since they entered the chamber, finally spoke. "And the children? What superior knowledge justifies what you have done to innocent children?" Lydia's smile widened, revealing teeth that had been filed into sharp points, a body modification that added a supernatural element to her already disturbing appearance. The children taught us about purity, about how the taste of innocence can literally be experienced, knowledge that certain people in certain cities have paid fortunes to acquire. The chamber was filling with other members of the rescue expedition, all carrying lanterns that cast dancing shadows on the walls, decorated with horrors. The contrast between the flickering light and the atrocities on display created an atmosphere that felt more like a nightmare than reality. Some of the younger men on the expedition began to vomit when they fully understood what they were seeing. "Where are the prisoners?" demanded Whitfield, struggling to stay focused on his rescue mission amid the surrealist scene. Lydia gestured casually to tunnels that branched off from the main chamber. "Oh, they're safe, well cared for. In fact, some are being prepared for specific customers who have particular preferences. Others are participating in experiments that help us better understand the limits of human endurance." It was then that the screams began to echo through the tunnels, desperate sounds of people who were clearly still alive and in terrible suffering. The sound galvanized Whitfield's men, who immediately split into groups to explore the side tunnels in search of the prisoners. What they found in these smaller chambers confirmed that Lydia's crimes had reached levels of depravity that defied human comprehension. In one chamber, they found 12 people chained to the walls, some of whom had been missing for months. They were malnourished and traumatized, but alive. In another, they found evidence of primitive medical experiments that had been conducted on conscious victims. A third chamber contained something that made even Hunter Jake, hardened by decades of life in the wild mountains, run off to vomit. As the rescue of the prisoners proceeded, Lydia continued her macabre conversation with Whitfield, talking about her work with the pride of an artist, discussing her most important creations. She described how she had developed techniques to keep victims alive for prolonged periods, how she had created a classification system for different types of human flesh, and how she had established a distribution network that extended to the nation's largest cities. The most fascinating thing, she said, her eyes shining with genuine enthusiasm, was discovering how different emotions affect taste. Fear produces a certain acidity. Desperation has a sweeter quality, and hope has a unique flavor that our discerning customers consider a supreme delicacy. It was clear that Lydia had long since crossed any line that separated her from normal humanity. She showed no remorse, regret, or even understanding that her actions were morally repugnant. Instead, she talked about her crimes with the satisfaction of someone who had found her true calling in life. The rescue of the prisoners revealed the true magnitude of the horror that Lydia Krenshaw had created in her underground realm. Among the victims were people who had disappeared not only in recent weeks, but over several years. Some had been held captive for so long that they could barely remember their previous lives. Others had been broken psychologically in ways that might never be repaired. One particularly shocking discovery was a woman identified as Rebecca Turner, who had disappeared from a farm in Tennessee 3 years earlier. She had been reported dead by her family, who had even held a symbolic funeral. Rebecca was almost unrecognizable, transformed by years of captivity into something that barely looked human. When the rescuers tried to approach her, she cringed in terror, clearly conditioned to expect only pain and suffering from any human contact. Even more disturbing was the discovery that some of the prisoners had been forced to participate in the organization's activities. Under constant threats of death and torture, several victims had been coerced into helping in the processing of other prisoners, creating a hierarchy of horror where the victims themselves became instruments of victimization. The resulting psychological trauma was visible in the empty, hopeless eyes of people who had been forced to abandon their own humanity in order to survive. As the rescue work continued, Lydia watched everything with an expression of genuine disappointment, as if the invaders were ruining something precious. "You have no idea what you're destroying," she muttered to Whitfield. "It took us years to create this system, to perfect our methods, and now you come here as barbarians, destroying art that can never be replicated." Sheriff Whitfield was beginning to realize that he was dealing with something that went far beyond ordinary criminal insanity. Lydia had created a complete philosophy around her crimes, a worldview that justified any atrocity as part of a greater purpose. She truly believed that she was engaged in some kind of important pioneering work that history would one day recognize as revolutionary. "How many people died here?" Whitfield asked, knowing that he would probably never get an accurate number. Lydia tilted her head as if she were doing mental calculations. "Dying is such a limited word, Sheriff. We prefer to think that they have been transformed, that their essences have been preserved in a purer form. As for the number, well, we kept meticulous records. I believe we have processed approximately 240 people during our operation here in Tennessee. Of course, that doesn't include our previous work in Kentucky, nor the smaller operations in other states." The number was much higher than anyone had imagined. If Lydia was telling the truth, she and her organization had been responsible for one of the largest murder series in American history up to that point. The magnitude of the crimes transformed the case from a local investigation into something that would have national repercussions. As more details emerged during the cave searches, it became clear that Lydia's operation had been funded by a clientele that included some of the richest and most powerful people in the country. Correspondence found in a chamber that served as an office revealed names that shocked even the experienced Sheriff Whitfield. Politicians, industrialists, members of high society from cities such as New York, Boston, and Chicago, all had participated in the services offered by the organization. One folder of documents contained detailed contracts for exclusive dining experiences held in private mansions and secret clubs. The prices charged were astronomical. Some meals cost the equivalent of the annual salary of an ordinary worker. There were even descriptions of themed events where wealthy patrons paid to participate in manhunts staged in the mountains, with prisoners being released and then chased for the entertainment of the participants. The discovery of these documents created a dire dilemma for Whitfield. He realized that he was dealing not only with local criminals, but with a network of corruption that stretched to the highest levels of American society. Arresting Lydia and her direct accomplices would be relatively simple, but going after the wealthy and powerful clientele would be a task that could destroy careers and even put lives in danger. While wrestling with these implications, Whitfield was interrupted by screams coming from one of the side chambers. Hunter Jake had made a discovery that would completely change his understanding of the situation. In a chamber hidden behind a seemingly solid wall of stones, he found something that looked like something out of a fever nightmare. The secret chamber was smaller than the others, but it contained evidence of rituals that went far beyond simply killing and eating victims. There were symbols painted on the walls with substances that were clearly human blood, arrangements of bones that formed complex geometric patterns, and in the center of the chamber, a makeshift altar surrounded by candles made of something Jake preferred not to identify. On the altar was a book bound in human leather, its pages covered with writings in a mixture of English and symbols that seemed to have originated in ancient occult traditions. The book contained not only detailed records of each victim, but also descriptions of specific rituals performed during the murders. Lydia and her followers weren't just killing people. They believed they were channeling some kind of supernatural power through their crimes. The discovery of the book revealed that Lydia's crimes had a spiritual dimension that investigators had not suspected. She wasn't just a murderer or even a cannibal. She had become the leader of a cult that viewed murder and cannibalism as religious sacraments. Her followers genuinely believed that they were participating in something sacred, something that elevated them above the common morality of humanity. When confronted with the discovery of the ritual book, Lydia finally showed genuine emotion, not remorse or fear, but pride. "Now you begin to understand," she said, her eyes shining with religious fervor. "We were not simply criminals. We were the guardians of ancient knowledge, practitioners of traditions that date back to before civilization. Every life we took was an offering. Every meal we prepared was a communion with forces you can't even imagine." The arrest of Lydia Krenshaw marked the end of one of the most disturbing investigations in American history, but its ramifications would stretch for decades. When authorities finally removed all surviving prisoners and evidence from the cave complex, they found that they were dealing with something that defied conventional criminal categorization. It wasn't just mass murder. It wasn't just cannibalism. It was a complete perversion of everything that defines human civilization. During her transport back to Kentucky, Lydia maintained the same disturbing calm she had shown during her capture. She chatted casually with her captors, offering details about her victims as matter-of-factly as one might discuss the weather. When Whitfield tried to question her about the names on the list of wealthy clients, she just smiled and said that some secrets were too valuable to reveal for free. The trial of Lydia Krenshaw became a national sensation. Journalists from across the country traveled to Harland to cover the case of the Appalachian Cannibal Witch, as the press had dubbed her. The makeshift courtroom in the small town was filled with onlookers, reporters, and people who simply couldn't believe that such atrocities had taken place on American soil. During the trial, Lydia served as her own advocate, refusing any attorney who tried to represent her. Her statements in court were just as disturbing as her confessions in the cave. She described her crimes with pride, explaining her techniques and philosophies as if she were giving an academic lecture. When the prosecutor tried to get her to show remorse for the families of her victims, she replied that she was only sorry that her work had been interrupted before she reached her full potential. The verdict was unanimous and inevitable: guilty of first-degree murder on multiple counts. The death sentence was pronounced on a gray September afternoon, and Lydia received it with the same calmness that had characterized all her behavior since her capture. Her last words in court were a promise that others would continue her work, and that society would one day understand the importance of her contributions to human knowledge. Lydia Krenshaw was executed by hanging in October 1895 in the presence of a mob that had traveled from several states to witness the end of the woman who had become a symbol of pure wickedness. Even in her last moments, she maintained her composure, refusing to make any final statement beyond an enigmatic smile that haunted everyone present. But Lydia's death did not completely end the story. In the months following her execution, several people mentioned in her documents began to mysteriously disappear. Some were wealthy patrons who had attended her macabre banquets. Others were members of her organization who had managed to escape during the cave attack. It has never been determined whether these deaths were the result of guilt suicide, murders by other members of the network, or something more sinister. Sheriff Whitfield spent the rest of his career chasing the loose threads of the Krenshaw case. He quietly investigated several of the names found in Lydia's documents, but found that people with financial resources and political connections were virtually impossible to prosecute without irrefutable evidence. Much of the most incriminating evidence simply disappeared from official files, and key witnesses were found dead under suspicious circumstances. Hunter Jake never spoke publicly about what he saw in Lydia's caves. Those who knew him noticed that he changed profoundly after the experience, becoming more withdrawn and eventually abandoning his hunting expeditions in the mountains altogether. He spent his final years as a hermit, living alone in a secluded hut and avoiding any contact with other humans. Lydia's surviving victims faced varying fates. Some were able to gradually reintegrate into society, although they carried psychological scars that never completely healed. Others never recovered from the trauma, spending the rest of their lives in institutions or living as recluses, unable to trust any human being again. Mary Beth Collins, the courageous young woman whose testimony had been crucial in locating Lydia, moved to a distant city and took on a new identity. She never married or had children, and those who knew her in her later years described a woman who seemed to be always looking over her shoulder, as if expecting the horrors of her past to catch up with her at any moment. The cave complex where Lydia had established her reign of terror was sealed off by the authorities, but that didn't stop it from becoming a dark local legend. For decades, people have reported strange sightings in the area, mysterious lights, unexplained sounds, and an oppressive sense of evil that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. The area was eventually abandoned altogether, becoming a place that even the bravest Highlanders avoided. Today, more than a century later, the story of Lydia Krenshaw stands as one of the most disturbing cases in American criminal history. It represents something that goes beyond simple human evil. It symbolizes civilization's ability to produce monsters that challenge our basic understanding of human nature. In the isolated mountains of Appalachia, where the law came slowly and secrets could be kept for generations, she created a realm of horror that may never be fully understood. The true extent of her crime network was never fully revealed. Documents that might have exposed her most powerful accomplices disappeared from official archives, and investigations into connections to the elite of American society were quietly abandoned. Some historians suggest that the Krenshaw case exposed only the tip of an iceberg of corruption and depravity that extended to the highest levels of society. On dark winter nights, when the wind winds through the peaks of Appalachia, locals still whisper stories about Lydia Krenshaw. They tell of a woman who sold her soul for forbidden knowledge, who turned the most fundamental act of human existence, sustenance, into something monstrous and perverse. And they wonder in the depths of their hearts how many others like her can be hiding in the shadows of civilization, waiting for their opportunity to emerge and show the world how thin the line that separates humanity from absolute barbarism really is.